Hello, everyone. Happy to be with great personality in the domain of higher education. This webinar will dedicated to the governance in higher education. We will present a new book in the governance of education, which will be presented by Dr. Glen Jones. Uh, Welcome, Dr. Glen Jones. Happy to welcome you to this webinar organized by Amaka Institute.
Well, thank you very, very much. It's my great pleasure. And I want to thank you, Dr. Naji, for your leadership in inviting me for this. And I want to thank the Amakan think tank for their initiative in this work. I've been familiar a little bit with the Amakan's work, and I know it's had a tremendous influence in the region, and that it's been a source of rigorous thought in relation to issues of quality in higher education. And so I'm very pleased to contribute to your ongoing communication efforts and sharing of research findings with this session. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Glen Jones, for accepting my invitation to present your new book at this webinar. Professor Glen Jones, who served as Dean of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education from 2050 to 2021, has been named a recipient of the Vivek Joel Citizenship Award. Professor Jones is widely recognized as distinguished academic administrator and internationally renowned scholar. Jones has led and served on various working groups, task forces, advisory, and special committees. Most recently, he was chair of the Provost's Campus Advisory Group of Lifelong Learning and member of the Provost's Advisory Committee on Metrics and Strategic Mandate Agreements. Thank you again, Mr. Jones, and you can take about 30 minutes to talk about your new book.
Well, thank you very much once again, and I look forward to participating in this conversation. I'm just going to share my screen.
It's okay.
Okay. So thank you once again. This is quite an honor for me, so I appreciate the opportunity. I recognize that the think tank is located in Morocco, and that it has considerable influence in the region. I'm going to move on the assumption that that most of the audience is not very familiar with higher education in Canada or higher education governance in Canada. So I'm going to gear the presentation to provide a kind of elementary introduction to some elements of Canadian higher education, in particular governance, as well as describing some of the key themes relating to the book. I say that in advance because if there are participants from Canada, you may find that I'm going over territory you already know very well. But I recognize that many of the participants here are individuals who are interested in Canadian higher education, but may not be very aware of some of the nuances of Canadian higher education. So the new book we're talking about is called University Governance in Canada, Navigating Complexity. And this is a book that came out in mid-August. It's 6 weeks or so, but it's been out. It's generating some modest attention, I think, in Canada. So I'm looking forward to the notion of the kind of conversation that it may be able to stimulate. I do want to acknowledge that there's 4 authors of this book: Julia Eastman, myself, Claude Trottier, Olivia Beguencoet. And I also want to acknowledge that Julia Eastman is very much the first author of the book. She played an important leadership role in getting this book going, and everyone has contributed, but she certainly is very much the first author of the volume. I also want to say just a few words about Canadian higher education more generally. before I start talking about the project. Um, Canadian higher education, I think, has some distinct features that are important for the conversation. One is that it's very much a high participation system of higher education, and that it's one of the, I don't know, dozen or so countries in the world. Perhaps that number is increasing every year, but we have very large participation rates with more than 50% of the normal age group moving on to post-secondary education. In Canada, according to OECD statistics, has one of the highest educated populations on the planet. So it's a high participation system, high levels of access, lots of challenges in terms of access, but a high access system. It's primarily a public system. So it's very different than the United States, which has quite a large private system of higher education. Almost all the major universities in Canada are public. There is a small private sector, but it generally enrolls a quite small percentage of the population. Third is to recognize that this is a research-intensive system. In other words, there's a high level of research productivity using most benchmarks, and Canadian universities make quite substantial contributions in terms of research. So this is a high access, high research system of higher education. And while we certainly don't have good international indicators of quality, I think most would argue that this is at least a good quality system of higher education. Certainly, most of the indicators I've seen, some benchmarking that's taken place, the quality of higher education in Canada is at least good, and probably compares well with most other systems. So in terms of what I'm trying to do here today, I thought I'd provide some background to the new book, and focus on some key contextual features that may be particularly important for an audience that doesn't understand Canada particularly well or does not understand the Canadian context particularly well. And that is to talk a little bit about federalism, about provincial systems, common and distinct elements in these provincial systems, and university governance, and a concept that I'll call relative autonomy, which I'll discuss in more detail a little later on. So that's my general objective for this session. Our research team began this project more than a decade ago, and we really had a fairly simple objective. We wanted to do a study that would look at university governance by looking at detailed case studies of 6 flagship universities, and that is leading universities within 5 Canadian provinces. We had all done studies on governance before. I've published 2 or 3 books on university governance in different ways. All of the contributors have had some work on policy or governance relating issues, but we wanted to do something together that would essentially bring us to the notion of trying to take a look at 6 leading universities in the context of 5 provinces. Because the provinces are so different in Canada, understanding something about how these universities are governed within that provincial context, we thought would be meaningful and helpful in terms of contributing to the literature. Our definition of governance is very broad. It's about how decisions are made within systems of higher education. So it's about both system level federal and provincial governments and the role that they play within institutional governance, as well as institutional governance itself. And in terms of institutional governance, we were interested not only in the highest levels, and that is not just about boards and senates and the role of university administration, but also looking down through the institution. So our case studies were based on interviews with a range of university leaders, presidents, vice presidents, other senior leaders, as well as community members. So we talked to deans and faculty association leaders and student association leaders and department chairs, as well as government officials and a review of other individuals in sort of agencies that were related to the study, as well as looking at a wide range of documents and policies. So we were really trying to understand something about how do these institutions make decisions? What are the structural arrangements? What are some of the elements of culture that may be important? How do we understand the relationship between the provincial governments, the federal government, and how this institution is operating? And of course, with lots of evidence from documents and news reports and others that would assist us in that analysis. So that's the University Governance in Canada project, the way it began. And the project also, the case studies that we focused on were really of 6 universities in 5 provinces. So the University of British Columbia in British Columbia, the University of Alberta in the province of Alberta, the University of Toronto in the province of Ontario, the University of Montreal in the province of Quebec, University of Quebec at Montreal, sometimes called UQAM, which is in the province of Quebec, and Dalhousie University, which is in the province of Nova Scotia. We wanted to look at all of these are the largest and perhaps preeminent universities within those jurisdictions. The University of Montreal and the University of Quebec in Montreal were chosen for similar reasons. The University of Montreal is the largest university in the province of Quebec, a very research-intensive university. In fact, I think it's probably one of the largest and most research francophone universities in the world. The University of Quebec in Montreal is part of a University of Quebec system. It has a different governance arrangement, and we're very interested in understanding something about that University of Quebec system and how this university, which might be considered the flagship within the University of Quebec, how it is organized and how its governance structure may be the same or different from other institutions on the list. So that was the reason for choosing two quite different universities in the province of Quebec. So we published a number of papers based on that original analysis after we completed the case studies. The book is a slightly different notion, and that is clearly we had the case studies and we had this wonderful detailed information that we could use. But with the book, we really wanted to write for a broader audience. And so the book is 450 pages or so long. It's not a short book. But our notion really was to try and make a broader contribution to the literature on higher education in Canada. So we did that by providing an overview of the history of Canadian universities and Canadian university governance. We updated the case studies to examine some recent shifts and challenges, to try and take a look at how they were addressing some recent problems that were emerging within those particular institutions. We reviewed governance arrangements and other select systems with the objective of trying to locate Canadian higher education within an international context. And we also were trying to kind of stimulate a broad discussion of university governance in Canada. And to the extent that it's possible, try and introduce something about Canadian higher education and Canadian university governance to an international audience, because we think there is something about Canadian higher education which is interesting and distinctive. Not trying to suggest it's better, but we are trying to suggest that it may be something worth looking at for those outside Canada who are interested in exploring issues of governance in higher education. So that was our objective in terms of the book. So it's a broad book. It looks at the governance issues from a broad series of dimensions, and we've tried to update and to provide a kind of international context to the Canadian situation. If we turn then to the kind of objectives, and I talked about federalism as one of the key contextual features. It is quite important to recognize the importance of federalism as we think about governance arrangements. I think most of the people here are quite aware of what federations are. It's a national political arrangement involving a constitution where authority is delegated to two or more levels of government, and that neither are subordinate to the other. In other words, both of these levels of government have independent authority under that constitutional arrangement. And this is a particularly important issue within higher education. And it's an issue that has received surprisingly little attention, I think. Federations are an important political arrangement that they capture almost 40% of the world's population and 45% of the land mass. And there's been quite limited research on higher education in relations to federations, which I think is quite interesting, because I think that many of the federations are extremely different and have very different arrangements. In the case of Canada, the important thing about federalism is to recognize that under the Canadian Constitution arrangement, education is assigned to the provinces. So there are 10 provinces and there are 3 territorial governments, and those all have their own distinct 13 systems of higher education. Each has its own policy arrangements, each has its own institutional arrangements, and the provinces are largely responsible for regulating higher education. The federal government does play a role in a variety of ways, but intersect with higher education. This is particularly true in terms of research and development. It's particularly true in terms of international education, where both the provinces and the federal government need to have some element of coordination for international education to work. It's true in terms of human rights and equity elements. in terms of the language support. And by that, I mean language support for the minority language in what is ostensibly a bilingual country. Cultural policies, the federal government plays some role in. It has a particular role in terms of Canada's Indigenous peoples. And all of these various roles clearly intersect with higher education and have implications to some extent with higher education governance. There are both, and this also means that there are both regional and national higher education organizations and stakeholders. So there are national organizations relating to universities and faculty associations and students, but there are also provincial organizations or collectives or networks that play a role as we think about governance and sharing of information within the system. What there isn't is a national Ministry of Education or higher education. There's no single office at the federal government level that has responsibility for education or higher education. In fact, there is a hesitation for the federal government even to use the word education in many of its activities because that's a responsibility of the provinces. There's no national accreditation or quality assessment mechanism, no national degree standards, etc. These are all left in the hands of the provinces, some of which have been worked out collectively because there are credential frameworks, for example, but those are worked out between the provinces. But most of these decision structures are provincial in terms of their orientation. So you've got a large country. You've got the second largest country on earth with a modest population, 36 or 37 million. And as you'll see, I talked about the various provinces they're represented that include British Columbia on the far left, Alberta, Ontario in the middle, Quebec, which is just to the right of the middle, and Nova Scotia, which is in the far right in the maritime provinces of Canada. So this is our attempt at some geographic distribution within the Canadian context. In terms of the evolution of university governance, excuse me, it's perhaps important to recognize that there were relatively few public universities in Canada until the 20th century. There are a handful of universities that can trace their histories back to the early decades of the 19th century. A few emerged later on, but the vast majority of Canadian universities trace themselves to a history, public universities, trace themselves to a history of the 20th century, usually the early 20th century. And there was certainly no clear model of how public universities should be governed. In fact, there were some considerable experimentation of different approaches to how universities might be governed. And in some cases, some major controversies over the relationship between universities and governments, provincial governments, during this time period. The situation got so bad in the province of Ontario that a royal commission was created that we generally call the Flavel Commission. And it was charged with the responsibility of providing a recommendation on how the University of Toronto might be governed. The basic premises of that commission, or at least the assumptions that commission articulated that later became part of the University of Toronto Act, could be summarized in a couple of basic points. They recommended a bicameral governance model, and that is that there should be two governing bodies for the university. The notion of a university board, they thought that the authority of the province, the responsibility of the province should be delegated to a board that would be essentially the corporate university. And they gathered the idea of this kind of a board from their visits and the information they obtained from some of the American state universities during the time period. The idea was to separate the university from partisan political politics. The university would essentially be divorced from partisan politics. The government would essentially shift its authority to the governing board, and the governing board would act in the best interests of the university and be largely composed of citizens who were kind of wise citizens within the community. But the second board was, of course, the Academic Senate, which people were quite familiar with because of its Oxbridge roots and the idea of a Senate that would be largely composed of internal senior faculty. And both of these bodies would be enshrined in university legislation. So the idea is that you create a bicameral structure, two governing bodies, a board largely composed of external members, which have overall oversight of the institution, and an internal academic senate that would have be largely responsible for academic decision making within the institution. And this model, this fairly simple model, was quite clearly articulated within the commission. And because of that, and because of the timelines and the time period it was in, that model was adopted or adopted in almost every Canadian university during that time period. So there are a number of new universities that were emerging in Western Canada that drew a lot of their enthusiasm or a lot of their ideas from the Laval Commission. Others moved more slowly, but the basic idea of the separation of academic and administrative oversight, this broad role of a board and a Senate, became part of the assumptions underscoring governance for most universities in Canada. The universities themselves are created by provinces. So they are created as legal entities by the provinces. And except in two provinces, British Columbia and Alberta, every university has its own act or charter. And this charter establishes the university, creates a governance structure, and assigns the university with the authority to make its own decisions, and enter into contracts, and make employment decisions. So universities are created as not-for-profit private institutions. They are government funded, but they are created as private entities that do not have a profit motive. And that's their basic legal structure. British Columbia and Alberta have a similar notion, but the two provinces have created omnibus legislation. So BC has a Universities Act, but essentially governs all of the universities in the province of Alberta. Alberta has an even in the province of British Columbia, sorry. Alberta has a Post-Secondary Learning Act that essentially governs all of the post-secondary institutions in the province. And it differentiates different forms of governance depending on the institutional form. So there is a distinction with this notion of having a provincial act as opposed to individual university acts. And we talk about that a little bit in the book. But the basic notion is that each of the universities has considerable independence. They are legal corporations. They have the ability to make their own decisions, enter into contracts, make employment decisions, etc. They're really designed as distinct corporations that they're independent from government, recognizing that there are different levels of independence. I think the BC and Alberta, and to some extent the University of Quebec system, have a slightly different level of independence than the other provinces and the other institutions. But it's relative, is what I would say. In terms of common elements in governance, as I've already said, there is most universities in Canada have a university board, and this is clearly the corporate university board. It appoints the president usually, or it does so on the advice of some other process. It has financial oversight, and it is the overall responsibility for the university. But the acts that create the university also create senates. So that the senates are designed to govern academic policy issues. In some cases, that's narrowly defined. In some cases, the Senate has broad advisory responsibilities within the institution. But what's important is that both kinds of bodies, sometimes named differently, are part of the legislation. So the Senate is not subject to the board. It's in some independent authority under the provincial legislation, which is quite different than in some other jurisdictions. And then you have the university president, normally regarded as the chief executive officer, responsible for the day-to-day operations and for employing university staff and dealing with other levels of administration within the institution. The other common element in governance, I think across Canada, again with some variations in themes, is that we have very strong labor organization. And that's often organized at the institutional level. And these labor organizations often are unionized, and they represent faculty and support staff and many other labor groups. So the fact that labor organizations are strong and exist is also very important in terms of understanding Canadian university governance, because you have a board, you have a Senate, but you also have labor unions, which are engaged in conversations about some of the same issues and some of the same themes that emerge. Clearly, academic labor unions and most faculty are unionized. There are some universities do not have formal labor unions, but even in those, there are forms of agreement that are very similar to collective agreements. And they deal certainly with salary and benefits, as one might expect in talking about labor organizations. but they also deal with a number of policies that might be considered academic policies and that might be part of the role of academic councils or senates in some other jurisdictions. I'm thinking here, for example, most of these collective agreements include policies about new appointments, about tenure, about promotion policies, and perhaps most importantly, about academic freedom. Universities clearly have policies about academic freedom, but many of the labor agreements also have language about academic freedom. And if there are interventions in academic freedom, it's often dealt with as an employment issue. In other words, it's protected by the labor union, or it is dealt with as a grievance and a concern, but is dealt with through mechanisms that are part of the labor management relationship. And that's different than in other systems where there might be some constitutional protection of academic freedom, or in others where it's a matter of the courts and things are dealt with very differently. In Canada, academic freedom tends to be dealt with as an issue of employment and part of the relationship, a protection of a part of the relationship that the faculty member has with the university as their employee. There are some common tensions in governance. There are the relationship between the board and the president is extremely important. And if this relationship fails, there can be some serious decisions that are made, including the president could be dismissed. So this relationship becomes very key. The president clearly has to keep the board informed. It has to maintain the confidence of the board. And there are some indications that university presidents in Canada are serving shorter terms of office, and in some cases are not completing their terms of office because of challenges in this relationship. The senates themselves are sometimes perceived as ineffective governing bodies. We did not come across that very much in our study, but there's other research that suggests that. Academic staff engagement is sometimes low. In other words, academic staff are often involved with research and teaching, and their ability to find the time to engage in some forms of self-governance may be a bit more limited. There are tensions, of course, between the Senate as the sort of center of collegial decision-making and the faculty association as an organization working on behalf of the collective body of faculty. And we do see sometimes tensions because faculty associations and senates are sometimes dealing with somewhat similar issues. I'm not trying to suggest a major source of tension, but I do think that many of the issues that faculty associations are dealing with are issues that in other systems would be dealt with academic self-governance. So that there is this tension between the various roles of how to represent faculty interests in the context of the university. And there are general problems about principal-agent relationships, about the president in relation to the board and the Senate. The board clearly employs the president to sort of run the day-to-day operations of the university. And there are questions of accountability, transparency, and of course there is this added complexity because to some extent there are two governing boards, and so the president has to essentially navigate between the board that employs her or him and the academic senate, which plays a role in key academic policy issues. There are major differences by institution. So while I talked in general terms about some commonalities, each of the case universities had quite different governance structures, and there were specific arrangements within these institutions. The University of Toronto, which began as a bicameral institution, had emerged as a unicameral institution in the 1970s. Many of the universities we looked at were bicameral. One was tricameral. So there are differences in these structures that become quite important. It is important to recognize that another distinctive feature of Canadian higher education governance is that the governing boards include both internal and external members, which is unheard of in some countries like the United States, for example. So all of the governing boards we looked at included not only external members, sometimes appointed by government, but also faculty and students. And all of the senates we looked at have very strong student representation, as well as some representation from other internal constituencies. There are common challenges in these institutions, but there were distinctive responses. We didn't talk very much about organizational culture, but one could argue that there are distinctive cultural arrangements here. different histories, different leadership, and that provincial contexts clearly make a difference in these arrangements. In terms of the provincial governments, generally speaking, provincial governments have allowed Canadian universities considerable autonomy. And there's been a lot of previous research that has tried to look at measuring autonomy in different countries. Canada usually looks pretty good in terms of a level of autonomy that most universities have. But this is shifting. Clearly, there's increasing regulation of universities. That's primarily focusing on financial accountability, but not only financial accountability. There's increasing use of new funding mechanisms, such as key performance indicators, some increasing interest in performance funding in several provinces, the notion of sort of government university contracts or individual letters of agreement between provincial governments and individual institutions seem to be an increasing interest in terms of funding mechanisms. There's increasing regulation in some provinces of things like executive salaries, trying to ensure that university presidents aren't paid very much, or trying to keep a cap on these large salaries. And involvement in policy areas such as free speech. Several provinces have created free speech policies. The government of Quebec introduced legislation on academic freedom, trying to protect academic freedom. Whether the government of Quebec has just been reelected, and whether they continue to pursue that area, I don't know. A lot of interest in sort of sexual violence policies. In other words, ensuring that universities have policies that deal with issues of sexual harassment, sexual violence, and related matters. But generally, there's been little interference in sort of academic policy issues. And that includes relatively little accountability for quality in Canadian higher education on the part of provincial governments. They've largely left that in the hands of the institutions or in the hands of professional bodies, where that becomes important. There are differences by province. We saw major differences in the political and the policy context. Again, there are political and ideological differences by province. BC, Alberta, and the Quebec system have quite distinctive arrangements compared to some of the other jurisdictions. We talk about this in considerable detail in the book, and I'm not going to do it now. But the key, I think, is that the provinces are different. They have different regulatory and accountability arrangements. They have different views of university autonomy. There are common themes and common challenges, but the differences are interesting, and they have implications, I think, for university governance that become quite interesting. I want to say just a moment about relative autonomy, and this is a set of ideas that we use in the book, and that were part of our themes as we began to explore this notion. Bourdieu, as many of you know, talked about a distinction between mass modes of production and restrictive modes of production, or elite production. And our assumption to some extent is that public universities experience a tension between their need to respond to external stakeholders, to kind of fulfill a mass production mode, at the same time maintain their elite roles and their elite modes of production associated with the creation of new knowledge and the creation of mechanisms for the dissemination of new knowledge. In other words, universities have to be responsive. They have to be responsive to external stakeholders. At the same time, they can't lose sight of the notion that one of their cornerstones is the creation of new knowledge. It is essentially to allow professors to do what they do, provide them with independence and flexibility, and to essentially, have an elite mode of production where faculty are largely writing papers for other faculty to read within a very elite mode. And so the question is how to balance this notion between these two elements. And the notion is that the universities can't go too far in either direction. A university that becomes too elite and too restrictive loses faith of government and loses faith of the broader population. An institution that moves too far in the opposite direction, where the work of the professoriate is viewed very much as an instrument of government policy or external policy stakeholders, will lose its respect and lose its positioning within the field of higher education. So universities have to find a balancing between these two broad forms of tension: this notion of independent elite decision making and this notion of being externally responsive to external stakeholders and participating and engaging in the broader external community. Our study suggests that these universities, all of these universities, I think, have been able to maintain a balance. They've created policies that protect academic freedom. They have governance processes that reinforce academic self-governance of academic policies. At the same time, they're generally responsive to broader public interests. They are engaged with their communities and with their provinces. And while they're subject to continuing regulation, which I think is often problematic, governments have generally continued to respect autonomy of the universities, especially over broad academic matters. So overall, university governance is becoming increasingly complex and multidimensional. We talk a lot about that increasing complexity in the book. It's a challenging area of research, and it's a challenging area of decision making. University governance in Canada, it appears to be working. In other words, we're not trying to suggest that this is somehow a perfect system, but it is a system that seems to be working and has maintained a balance between responding to external stakeholders while also retaining academic self-governance and other key policy areas. And while it's subject to increasing government regulation and interference, there's a lot of evidence of resilience. In other words, that the system these mechanisms and these institutions seem to have been able to move, to shift, and they've certainly demonstrated a capacity to address some very challenging issues over the last decade or so. So that's a broad overview of the book. I'll give you a general thread of some of the key issues we tried to look at. And I thank you very, very much for your time and your attention. I look forward to any questions you might decide to share.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glen Jones, for your presentation. It was very interesting, very important subject. Governance has been defined to refer to structures and processes that are designed to ensure accountability, transparency, responsiveness, stability, equity and inclusiveness, empowerment and participation. We have some question to you, Dr. Glen Jones. The first question, in order to be successful, universities need to be able to take their own decision. The University Autonomy Tool, led by European University Association, let's compare university autonomy in about 29 European higher education systems. It focuses on 4 autonomy areas and ranks countries according to the level of autonomy they have in each of these. These 4 areas are organization, financial autonomy, staffing, and academic autonomy. What's about these four areas in your book? First question. Second question. The ranking of governance in higher education. How do you see this experience in Europe about the ranking of university autonomy?
Sure. I mean, I'm familiar. I shouldn't say quite familiar. I'm familiar with the studies that have been done. I think there's been a series of reports now which have used the same matrix of key themes, 4 broad areas, and then a whole series of issues underneath those themes. I mean, I think the structure of the report and the activities have largely been focused on a European issue. In other words, you have the governance reforms that have been taking place across Europe, the question of how to think about autonomy within those reforms, recognizing that you're talking about very different countries, very different histories, and largely a very different sense of autonomy. In most of the European countries, there's always been considerable emphasis on academic freedom and considerable notions of academic self-governance, sometimes related to and sometimes as a component of an understanding of academic freedom, but far less autonomy over organizational, administrative, financial, and other aspects of decision making. We didn't explicitly use that model in the book. We actually had talked about it because it first came out. The first publication, I think, came out about the same time we were thinking about the original project. But it didn't seem to be a good fit necessarily for the Canadian arrangement. And it created a certain kind of structure that didn't make as much sense in Canada as it does in some other jurisdictions. As I said, most of the studies about autonomy have generally positioned Canada as quite high on most of those dimensions. The areas where there are high levels of accountability relating to financial issues, and some of those areas are areas where some other jurisdictions may have greater freedom. But generally speaking, Canadian universities are dealt with as separate entities. They have considerable flexibility in terms of how they make decisions about money, how they make decisions about staff, how they make decisions about academic policies and degrees. So they do have a considerable element of autonomy. To some extent, then, they are a bit more in line with the original United Kingdom model, and perhaps the model that's generally thought of as American. The distinction, I think, that becomes important is that in all of these other systems, in all of the other Anglo systems, you've also seen considerable reforms that to some extent decrease institutional autonomy, or they've shifted and politicized institutions, as in the United States, for example. So I think autonomy is extremely important, and I think that universities are often in the best position to make decisions about where they go and what they want to do. But I do have to respect the right of the state to make decisions about how it spends its money, and to expect accountability for those funds. I think that the challenge that we have in Canada, as many systems have, is that government increasingly wants to interfere, and increasingly wants to move in certain decision-making areas. I think the reality is that occurs in Canada less than in many other jurisdictions, but that's from a Canadian observer rather than someone who's done a lot of measurement on some of these issues. So I think that I think autonomy is extremely important. I think that the project in Europe has been very useful within the European context in sort of demonstrating differences in how issues of autonomy have been taken up within the governance reform process, because I know that there's been tremendous governance reforms in Europe over the last 30 years, most of which have involved moving more towards the notion of a governing board and the notion of a more independent decision-making structure within institutions.
Thank you very much. Another question: what differences between quality assurance and governance, and how to use efficiently the two concepts?
Well, I think the governance question is who decides and who deals with quality, and so in many European jurisdictions, for example, to some extent, quality has been assigned to a national quality assurance agency. It doesn't mean that's the only body that's responsible for quality. But if you talked about who governs and who has a major role in this, the notion of a quality assurance agency outside of the university playing a major role has been an answer in at least some other jurisdictions. So the Canadian answer is a little bit different because there is no federal role here. And so there's no federal agency that deals with quality. There's no national quality assessment mechanism. The issue of quality is in the hands of the provinces. And the provinces have dealt with this issue very differently. For the most part, there really are not parallels in Canada to the kind of quality agencies that you see in many European jurisdictions. There are some similarities, but they're really quite different. In fact, if we talk about universities in provinces like Ontario and Quebec, generally speaking, the universities themselves have dealt with issues of quality. In other words, they created their own quality mechanisms as a way of ensuring quality standards within the system. And so the universities themselves have found mechanisms to kind of govern quality. And often allowing quite a bit of flexibility to individual institutions. So the universities themselves, either on their own as independent entities or as a collective, play a large role in quality assessment within Ontario and Quebec. There are some provincial agencies and other jurisdictions, but quality assurance is not dealt with as rigidly in Canada as it's dealt with in some other jurisdictions. There's a notion of greater institutional responsibility for quality rather than the notion of a sort of state responsibility.
And the last question, can you describe advantages and disadvantages of the absence of national quality assurance agency in Canada?
That's a good question. I mean, the reality is it would be very hard to create a national quality assurance agency, simply because of the realities of the Canadian Constitution. It is possible to create a kind of pan-Canadian. In other words, it's possible for the provinces to work together on this. I think that I think the question is, to what extent are governments trusting in the quality of the institutions that they've created? And I think, generally speaking, the provincial governments have sort of said, well, these are institutions of relatively high quality. And so there's a level of trust, I think, in the quality of these various institutions, and a reluctance to interfere dramatically in issues of quality within higher education. There are exceptions. I mean, in some provinces, there are quality assurance mechanisms that are required for new degree programs, for example. In Ontario and Quebec, the universities themselves have created mechanisms that involve periodic review of the quality of all degree programs. So there is an ethic and a notion of quality within the system. The question is who should be responsible for it. And I think the general notion is it's probably not a national responsibility. The notion is it's probably a provincial responsibility, because that's the responsibility for education is at the provincial level. But I think in reality, the notion is, well, maybe that should largely be an institutional responsibility. Maybe the universities themselves, if they're going to be autonomous, maybe they should assume a major responsibility for assuring the quality of their own programs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glen Jones, for your excellent presentation and your relevant answers to the questions. And congratulations again for the publication of this new book, this interesting and very important book. And I hope to be able to welcome you in Morocco.
Thank you very much. I look forward to visiting sometime.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.